He hadn't slept in 10 years. 10 years of lying in the dark with his eyes open and his mind running like a machine that had forgotten how to stop. 10 years of watching Los Angeles glow beneath his penthouse window at 3 in the morning, while the most powerful, feared, and untouchable man in Koreatown sat alone on the edge of a bed that cost more than most people earn in a year, and felt absolutely nothing but exhausted. Kwon Jae-sung ran an empire. Men trembled when he entered a room. Decisions that affected entire neighborhoods passed through his hands like water. The dragon tattooed up the left side of his neck told everyone who saw it exactly what kind of man they were dealing with. And yet, not one doctor, not one medication, not one person in his entire world of power and wealth and fear could give him the one thing a human being cannot survive without: peace. Until a black woman walked through his door. Aaliyah Cross was not wealthy. She was not powerful. She drove a car that made suspicious noises and sent money to her mother every week, and was 3 sessions away from giving up on the dream of ever owning her own clinic. She was a massage therapist, ordinary by every measure that Kwon Jae-sung had ever used to measure people. But she carried something in her hands that no amount of money had ever been able to buy. And the night she pressed her fingers to the back of his neck, something inside the most brutal man in Los Angeles began, slowly and without warning, to come undone. What happened between them next, nobody saw coming. Not his men, not the city, not even them. Before starting the story, comment down below where you are watching from and what time it is there. If stories of karma, love, and hidden truths move you, leave a like, be sure to subscribe to the channel, and click join to become a member and help our channel. There is a specific kind of exhaustion that money cannot touch. Not the tiredness that comes from a long day, or the heaviness that follows grief, or even the worn-out numbness that settles into a person after years of hard labor. Those kinds of tired have remedies: sleep, rest, time, a warm meal, a hand on the shoulder. Those kinds of tired respond to the world around them. But there is another kind, the kind that lives below all of that, beneath the muscle and the bone, somewhere in the part of a person that science has names for but cannot fully explain. The kind of tired that does not come from what you have done with your body, but from what you have done with your soul. And that kind, that specific, merciless, ancient kind of exhaustion, has no remedy that can be purchased, prescribed, or ordered. Kwon Jae-sung knew this with the certainty of a man who had tried everything else first. He stood at the window of his 18th floor suite at 3:47 in the morning, which was where he always stood at 3:47 in the morning, because the alternative was lying in a bed that felt like a very expensive surface for staring at a ceiling. The city of Los Angeles spread itself out below him like something that had been broken apart and reassembled carelessly. Lights scattered in every direction, highways threading between buildings, the permanent orange haze that hung above it all like a sky that had forgotten how to go dark. He had looked at this view more times than he could count. He had memorized it the way a prisoner memorizes the wall of a cell. The Audemars Piguet on his left wrist read 3:48 now. He had watched it change. On the bedside table behind him, a glass of water that had been poured hours ago and never touched. 3 prescription bottles arranged in a neat row. The work of an assistant who still believed that organization made things better. A folder containing information about a business matter that required his attention by 7 in the morning. He had read the folder twice. He could have recited it from memory. His mind did not struggle with information, with numbers, with names, with strategy. His mind was, in fact, the sharpest instrument he possessed, and it worked at full capacity 24 hours a day, without pause or mercy. Because it had no choice. because he never slept. Not truly. Not the way sleeping is supposed to work. The way it worked for every other human being on the planet who closed their eyes and simply disappeared for a few hours into something quiet and dark and restorative. For Kwon Jae-sung, sleep had become something that happened to other people. He drifted sometimes, shallow, restless intervals of something that was technically unconsciousness, but carried none of the benefits. And then the images came, as they always came, and he was awake again, sitting up in the dark with his heart doing something architectural to the inside of his chest. 10 years. A decade of this. He was 42 years old, and he felt, in certain specific moments, like something much older. The dragon tattooed on the left side of his neck, climbing from his collarbone to just behind his ear in ink that had taken 6 hours and had hurt exactly as much as he had wanted it to hurt, had been put there 12 years ago, when he was 30 and believed that the things a man carried on his skin said something true about who he was. He still believed that. He just no longer believed the dragon was the most honest thing on his body. The most honest thing was the darkness under his eyes, that no amount of cold water or expensive skincare could fully erase. His men did not speak about it. This was a matter of self-preservation on their part, and he respected the instinct, even while finding it lonely. Eddie Lim, who had been at his right hand for 7 years, and who was the closest thing Kwon had to a person he trusted completely, occasionally looked at him with an expression that contained something careful and unspoken. Eddie had learned, through trial and error, that careful and unspoken was the appropriate register for most things where his employer was concerned. It was Eddie who had come to him 2 weeks ago with the name written on a piece of paper. He had come back from 3 days in Tokyo. Business, always business. And had placed the paper on the desk with the quiet confidence of a man who had thought seriously about whether to mention it at all, and had decided, finally, that the situation warranted the risk. "There's a woman in Koreatown," Eddie had said. "Massage therapist. She has a clinic on Wilshire, small place, nothing impressive from the outside. But a contact of mine, the Tanaka Group's financial director, you've met him. He hadn't slept properly in 3 years. Chronic insomnia, doctors, medication, the whole thing. His wife made him try this woman as a last resort. That was 8 months ago." Kwon had looked at the paper without picking it up. "And? He sleeps now. 8 hours. He told me himself, said it was like something unlocked." The silence in the room had been long enough that Eddie had shifted his weight almost imperceptibly. "I know how it sounds," Eddie had added. "Book it," Kwon had said. He had not said it because he believed it would work. He had said it because he had run out of options that he believed in, and the only thing left was options he didn't. There was a particular mathematics to desperation that even the most rational mind eventually accepts. He turned away from the window now and looked at the room around him. Suite. Penthouse level. Everything in it had been selected by someone with excellent taste and a very large budget, and none of it had ever felt like anything other than an expensive container for his wakefulness. The furniture was dark and clean. The art on the walls was significant and cold. There were no photographs. He had made a decision about photographs a long time ago, and it was one of the few decisions from that period of his life that he did not revisit. His son was 9 years old now. He lived in Seoul with his mother, in a house that Kwon paid for and had never visited, because the arrangement that existed between himself and the boy's mother was one of those arrangements that functions only as long as certain boundaries are maintained. The boy was healthy. He was doing well in school. He had his mother's eyes, and, according to a photograph that had been sent 6 months ago through a lawyer, and that Kwon had looked at for a very long time before placing it in a drawer. He had his father's jaw. He thought about this sometimes, at 3:47 in the morning, when the city refused to go dark. The appointment was Thursday, 2 days away. He had been given a name, Aaliyah Cross, and a protocol, which was that she would arrive at 10 in the evening, and that his men were to treat her with the same professional courtesy extended to any consultant visiting on legitimate business. Eddie had handled the financial arrangements, which were generous enough to ensure she would come and discreet enough not to raise questions. Kwon was not a man who placed faith in things he could not verify. He was not superstitious, not spiritual in any way that he would have admitted to, not prone to hope as a general posture toward the future. Hope, in his experience, was something that other people used as a substitute for planning. He planned. He calculated. He managed variables. But at 3:48 in the morning, standing in a suite that cost more per night than Aaliyah Cross made in a month, looking out at a city that never stopped performing its indifference, he felt something that he would not have named as hope, but that occupied roughly the same place in his chest where hope would have lived, if he had been someone else. 2 days, he thought. He picked up the glass of water from the bedside table and drank it in 3 slow swallows. Then he sat down on the edge of the bed. Not to sleep. He had long since stopped approaching the bed with that particular intention, but simply because standing had become something that required more from him than it should have, and there was no one in the room to observe the concession. The dragon on his neck caught the edge of the city light through the window. His scarred hands rested open on his knees, palms up, the way hands rest when they are not holding anything and have nothing left to grip. Outside, Los Angeles continued to do what Los Angeles does at 3:48 in the morning. And Kwon Jae-sung waited, in the particular and total silence of a man who has forgotten what it feels like to stop. Thursday arrived the way days arrive when you have not slept, not as a beginning, but as a continuation of something that never stopped. Kwon had moved through the preceding 48 hours with the mechanical precision that had become his primary mode of existing in the world. Meetings in the morning, calls in the afternoon, 2 matters that required his physical presence in rooms where his physical presence was the entire point. Where the fact of him standing there, quiet and still and absolute, communicated everything that needed to be communicated without a single word being raised. He had eaten twice. He had not slept. He had checked the time with the regularity of a man counting down to something he refused to admit he was counting down to. By 9:30 that evening, his suite had been prepared according to instructions that Eddie had relayed without commentary. The main lights were dimmed. A portable massage table had been delivered and left assembled in the center of the living area, covered in clean white linen that looked almost aggressively wholesome against the dark palette of everything else in the room. 2 of his men were positioned in the corridor outside. A third was downstairs at the building entrance. Kwon had changed into his robe, dark navy, heavyweight, the silk lapel catching the low light, and was standing near the window again when the elevator opened at 10 minutes past 10. He heard her before he saw her. Not her voice, she wasn't speaking, but the particular quality of her footsteps in the corridor, unhurried and even, the sound of someone who was not intimidated by the geography of wealth. Most people who entered spaces like this for the first time did something with their pace. They either slowed down to absorb it, or they quickened to get through it. She did neither. She simply walked. When Eddie opened the door and she came in, Kwon turned from the window and looked at her directly, because he was a man who looked at things directly. It was one of the few habits he considered genuinely useful. Aaliyah Cross was not what he had constructed in his mind during the 48 hours of waiting. He had not built an elaborate image, but he had built something, some professional approximation, and she displaced it immediately simply by being present. She was tall and slender, dark skin catching the amber light of the suite with a warmth that made the room feel, for one brief and inexplicable moment, less like a container. Her natural hair framed her face in a full, unrestrained crown that she had not attempted to minimize or manage for the occasion of entering a penthouse suite at 10 in the evening. The sage green of her uniform was precise and clean. She carried a structured black bag over one shoulder, caramel leather handles, the strap worn in the way things get worn when they are used constantly and with purpose. She looked at him with eyes that were large and dark, and doing something that very few people's eyes did in his presence, which was looking without calculation. Not without intelligence. The intelligence was immediate and obvious, but without the specific kind of intelligence that assessed him for threat or opportunity. She was simply looking, taking in information the way a professional takes in information about a situation they are about to work with. "You are more tired than I expected," she said. It was not what anyone said to him. It was not close to what anyone said to him. The two men by the door did something infinitesimal with their posture. Kwan looked at her for a moment that was slightly longer than necessary. "And you are younger than I expected," he said. "People say that," she replied, setting her bag down on the low table near the massage table with the ease of someone who had been setting bags down in strangers' rooms for years and had long since made peace with the strangeness of it. "It stops being a compliment around the 15th time." He said nothing to that, but something in his jaw released a fraction of the tension it had been holding, which was the closest his face came to the expression another person might call almost amused. She asked him the standard questions with the calm efficiency of someone who had asked them hundreds of times, and understood that the questions themselves were partly the work, that the act of a person sitting still and answering simple questions about their own body was already a form of paying attention to something they had been ignoring. He answered in the short, complete sentences of a man unaccustomed to being asked about himself rather than about outcomes. Tension in the neck and shoulders, no allergies, no recent injuries, no specific area of focus requested. She had paused at that last answer. "No specific area?" "Everything," he said. She had nodded once, slowly, as though this was an answer she had encountered before and knew exactly what it meant. She selected her oils from the structured black bag with the deliberation of someone who was making a real decision, opening small dark bottles, holding them briefly, setting two aside and choosing a third. The scent that reached him across the room was something low and grounded and quiet. Sandalwood underneath, something else above it that he did not have a name for, and lavender threaded through both in a way that was present without being insistent. "You can lie face down," she said. "Take your time." He had expected, without having consciously thought about it, that the moment of lying down on the table, the fundamental vulnerability of the position, face down, eyes closed, another person's hands about to make contact with the back of his neck, would produce in him the familiar resistance that his body applied to anything resembling surrender. He had expected to feel the particular alertness that arrived whenever a situation removed one of his tactical advantages. Instead, as he settled onto the table and the white linen received his weight, what he felt was something so unfamiliar that it took him several seconds to identify it. Stillness. Not the stillness of controlled waiting, which was something he performed constantly, but the stillness of a body that had simply, for one moment, stopped bracing. It lasted approximately 4 seconds before his mind caught it and began analyzing it, which ended it. But 4 seconds was 4 seconds. He noted it the way he noted anything relevant. Her hands, when they first made contact with the back of his neck, were warm. Genuinely warm, not the clinical neutrality of a medical touch. and carried a pressure that was immediate and precise in the way that very few things were precise in his experience. Not hard, not soft. Exactly what the muscle required without him having communicated what the muscle required. He had read, somewhere in the research he had done over the years into the mechanisms of his insomnia, about something called proprioceptive memory, the body's ability to remember pressure, position, safety, and he had dismissed it as the kind of language that existed to make imprecise things sound scientific. He was less certain about that dismissal now. She worked without speaking for a long time, and he was grateful for this in a way that surprised him. Most people who entered his personal space felt the need to fill the silence. They narrated, they explained. They offered commentary on what they were doing, as though the doing itself were not sufficient evidence of the doing. She was quiet in the way that competent people are quiet. Not because there was nothing to say, but because the work was saying it. When she reached the base of his skull, pressing both thumbs upward along the ridge where the neck meets the head in the specific location that held, apparently, 10 years of everything he had refused to put down, he made a sound. It was involuntary and low and entirely outside his control, and he was aware of it approximately 1 second after it happened, which was 1 second too late to prevent it. It was the sound of a weight being set down. It was the sound of something that had been clenched for so long that the unclenching registered as almost painful before it registered as relief. She did not comment on it. She did not slow down or speed up. She simply continued with the same precise, unhurried attention, as though what had just happened was entirely ordinary. As though men like him made sounds like that every day. As though the unraveling of a decade's armor was just part of the work. He did not sleep. Not that night. But for 23 minutes, lying face down on a white linened table in a penthouse suite above a city that had never once offered him any version of quiet, Kwon Jae-sung's mind produced nothing. No calculations. No images. No weight. Just the pressure of her hands, the low scent of sandalwood and something unnamed, and the distant murmur of Los Angeles below, which for 23 minutes sounded almost like silence. When the session ended and she began quietly gathering her things, he lay still for a moment longer than was necessary. Then he sat up and looked at his hands, open on his knees, the scars catching the amber light.
"Same time next week," he said.
Aaliyah Cross looked at him across the table, her dark eyes doing that thing again, that looking without calculation, and said, "I'll check my schedule." "I'll double the rate," he said. A pause. Something moved through her expression that was not quite a smile, but was adjacent to one. "Thursday," she said. "Same time." The third Thursday was the one that changed everything, though neither of them would have been able to identify the exact moment it changed, because it did not happen in a moment. It happened the way most significant things happen. Gradually, and then all at once, and then in a way that made the gradual part feel inevitable in retrospect. The sessions had developed their own architecture by then. She arrived at 10. She set her bag on the low table. She chose her oils with the same deliberate attention as the first night, though she had begun varying the combinations in ways that suggested she was paying close attention to something. To him specifically, to the particular quality of his tension on a given evening, reading it the way a musician reads a room before deciding what to play. He would position himself at the window when she arrived, because that was where he stood, and she would move through the suite with the unhurried familiarity of someone who had decided, at some point between the first visit and the second, that the intimidating geography of the place was not her problem. She had stopped asking the intake questions after the second session. She knew the answers. Everything. Always. What had shifted, slowly and without announcement, was the silence between them. In the first session, it had been professional silence. The silence of two people maintaining appropriate distance across a significant power differential, each aware of the other's presence in the careful way that people are aware of things that could become complicated. By the second session, it had softened into something more like shared quiet. The silence of two people who had established, without discussing it, that neither of them required the other to perform comfort. And by the third session, the silence had become the kind that only exists between people who have begun, without intending to trust each other. It was in this silence, 20 minutes into the session, that he spoke. "My son is 9, he said. His voice was low and even, the way his voice always was. But there was something underneath it that was not usually there. Something unguarded. The verbal equivalent of the sound he had made at the base of his skull during the first session. Something released rather than said. Aaliyah's hands did not pause or change pressure. She said nothing for a moment, giving the words room to exist without immediately filling the space around them. Then, quietly, "What's his name?" "June," he said. "He has his mother's eyes. Is that a good thing?" A pause that was slightly too long. "Yes," he said finally. "She has kind eyes. She had a particular way of looking at things that made them seem less complicated than they were." "And you?" Aaliyah asked. "How do you look at things?" He considered this with the seriousness he applied to questions that deserved seriousness. "Accurately," he said. "That sounds lonely," she said. The words landed in the room with a quiet precision that was, in its own way, as accurate as anything he had ever said. He did not respond immediately. She did not retract it or soften it or follow it with something that would have made it easier to dismiss. She simply let it stand and continued working and waited. "It is," he said. It was the first time in 10 years, possibly longer, possibly ever in the specific way that he meant it, that Kwon Jae-sung had said that word in application to himself. Not as observation, not as strategic self-assessment, as admission. She said nothing, but something in the quality of her hands changed. Not the pressure, not the technique, but something more fundamental, something that existed below the level of technique, which was the difference between touching a person and being present with a person. He felt it the way you feel a change in temperature, not dramatically, but unmistakably. He slept that night, not for 20 minutes of blankness, not for a shallow interval of half-consciousness that could be argued either way. He slept for 4 continuous hours, deep and dark and entirely without imagery. And when he came out of it, he was sitting up in bed in the dark, with both hands pressed flat against the mattress, as though confirming that the surface was real. Because the absence of the dreams was so complete and so unfamiliar that waking from it felt like waking into a different country. He sat there for a long time. The clock read 4:22. Outside, Los Angeles performed its permanent incomplete darkness. He pressed his scarred hands harder against the mattress, felt the thread count of the sheets, the slight give of the mattress, the cool air of the suite on the back of his neck where the dragon climbed toward his ear. He had not felt the specifics of a room in 10 years. He had moved through rooms, registered them, assessed them, occupied them. But he had not felt them. Feeling required a nervous system that was not running entirely on alert. His nervous system, apparently, had taken the night off. He did not call Eddie. He did not call anyone. He sat in the dark and felt the room around him, and breathed in a way that was slower than his usual breathing. And the feeling that moved through him was one he recognized from a very long time ago, from a version of himself that existed before the decisions that had made him what he was. It was not happiness exactly. It was something quieter and more fundamental than happiness. It was the feeling of being, briefly, unafraid. The following Thursday came and she arrived, and he was at the window as always, but something had shifted in the way he stood there. He was still wearing the dark navy robe, still holding the particular stillness that was his resting state in the presence of other people, but he turned when she entered, with something fractionally different in his face. Not warmth exactly, not an expression that anyone observing from outside would have identified as warmth, but the absence of the distance that was usually there. A narrowing of the space between what he felt and what he showed. So slight as to be almost undetectable, but she detected it. She noticed things. This was the quality in her that had begun, over the course of these evenings, to produce in him something that he was not yet prepared to name, but that presented itself as a specific attentiveness whenever she spoke. A leaning in, internal and invisible. The orientation of a person who has found a frequency they did not know they were trying to find. "You slept," she said. It was not a question. 4 hours, he said. She smiled then. Not the adjacent to smile that she usually offered him, but a full, unguarded smile. The kind that involved her whole face and happened before she could decide whether to allow it. It lasted approximately 2 seconds before professional composure reassembled itself, but 2 seconds was enough. He had seen it. 4 hours is a beginning, she said. I haven't had a beginning in a long time, he said. She looked at him across the room with those large dark eyes that saw too clearly and too far. And for a moment, neither of them said anything. And the silence between them was different from all the previous silences. Charged in a way that was not uncomfortable, but was impossible to ignore. The silence of two people standing at the edge of something, and both being aware of it. Then she turned and began setting up, and he moved to the table, and the session proceeded with all of its usual precision and quiet. But the charge did not leave the room. It simply settled into the background, present and patient, the way important things are patient when they know they do not need to rush. It was near the end of that session, while she was working on the long muscles of his upper back, that the door of the suite opened without a knock. She heard it before she fully registered what it meant. Kwan's body registered it immediately and completely. She felt it happen under her hands. Every muscle she had spent an hour persuading toward release, contracting back to full alert in less than a second. A transformation so sudden and total that it was almost frightening to feel from the outside. In one motion, he was off the table and standing, the robe pulled together, his face entirely remade into something that had no memory of the previous hour. A man she had not seen before stood in the doorway. Not Eddie. Someone older, with the specific kind of stillness that belongs to men who have been dangerous for a very long time. He spoke in Korean, short and low, and did not look at Aaliyah at all, which was itself a communication about how he categorized her presence. Kwan responded in Korean, equally short. His voice had changed entirely. This was not the voice that said, "lonely in the dark." This was the voice that ran things. The man in the doorway nodded and withdrew. The door closed. Quan stood in the center of the suite for a moment, his back to her, the dragon on his neck visible above the robe's collar. Then he turned, and what she saw in his face was something that surprised her more than the interruption. It was not the cold blankness she expected. It was something complicated and briefly exposed, like a room caught with its lights on. "You should finish for tonight," he said. "Eddie will see you down." "Is everything—" "Yes," he said. Then, quieter, "I'm sorry." She had not expected the apology. She was almost certain he had not expected to give it. She packed her bag with steady hands and walked to the door, and just before she reached it, she stopped without fully turning around. "Thursday," she said. A pause behind her. Then, "Thursday." The envelope arrived on a Tuesday. Aaliyah was between clients when Eddie appeared at the front desk of the clinic, which was itself unusual enough to stop the room, because Eddie Lim, in his dark suit, standing in a sage green waiting area designed for calm and healing, was a particular kind of visual contradiction. He held the envelope with both hands, which she would think about later, because men like Eddie did not hold things with both hands unless they had been told to be careful with them. "From the boss," he said simply. She took it. He left. The receptionist at the front desk, a young woman named Petra, who asked very few questions and was paid well for this quality, looked at the envelope, and then at the door, and then back at her paperwork with the focused attention of someone who had decided that what she had just seen was not her business. Aaliyah took the envelope to the back room and sat down on the small chair beside the supply shelf and opened it with the deliberate steadiness of a person who has learned that the speed at which you open things affects how you receive what is inside them. The contract was real. She knew what she was looking at. She had looked at enough lease agreements over the past 2 years, had sat across from enough property managers with her folder of carefully saved documents and her carefully maintained expression of confidence, to recognize the structure of a commercial property purchase immediately. And this one was not a lease. It was a purchase. The address was on Vermont Avenue, 3 blocks from the clinic where she currently rented space, a corner property with large windows that she had walked past so many times that she had stopped allowing herself to look at it directly, because looking at it directly made the distance between where she was and where she wanted to be feel too precise. It was paid, fully, in her name. She read the document twice, the way she read everything important, and then she sat for a moment with it in her hands and the supply shelf in front of her, and the distant sound of the city outside, and something happening in her chest that was too large and too complicated to be only one feeling. It was gratitude, and it was something protective, and it was the very specific discomfort of receiving something enormous from someone whose world operated by rules she did not fully understand and had deliberately not asked about, because not asking had been the arrangement that made everything else possible. And then she read the note. The handwriting was strong and slightly irregular, the letters of a man who thought in straight lines and wrote in them too. "You gave me back 10 years of sleep. Let me give you back 10 years of your dream. Kay." She sat with that for a long time. Then she picked up her phone and called the number that was not listed anywhere, the number that had called her on an ordinary Tuesday evening 6 weeks ago and changed the particular mathematics of her life. And he answered on the second ring, which meant he had been near the phone, which meant something she did not examine too directly. "You couldn't just send flowers like a normal person?" she said, and her voice had something in it that she had not fully planned. A warmth and an unsteadiness that arrived together, and she did not attempt to correct either. There was a pause on his end, a pause with texture. She had learned to read his pauses the way she read muscle tension, as communication that was happening below the level of words. And then he laughed. It was not a long laugh or a loud one. It was the laugh of a man who had not laughed in long enough that the mechanism was slightly unpracticed, slightly surprised at itself. A low, genuine sound that lasted perhaps 3 seconds and contained within it something so undefended that she felt the back of her eyes sting in a way she absolutely refused to acknowledge while on the phone. "I am not a normal person, Aaliyah," he said. "No," she agreed, steadying her voice. "But you're getting there." Another pause, shorter this time. "Come Thursday," he said. "I want to tell you something." She wanted to ask what. She did not ask what. "Thursday," she said. She arrived that Thursday at 10, as always, but the suite was different when she walked in. Not in its physical arrangement, which was identical to every previous Thursday, but in the quality of the air inside it, which was the quality of a room where a decision has recently been made. Quan was at the window in the dark navy robe, as always, but he turned before she had fully crossed the threshold, which he did not usually do. He usually waited until she had set her bag down. He was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on him before. Not the controlled assessment of their first meeting, not the complicated exposure of the interrupted session, not even the brief unguardedness of the smile she had seen and filed away. This was something more settled. The expression of a man who has thought carefully about something and arrived, after significant internal negotiation, at a conclusion he intends to stand behind. "I'm leaving," he said. She stopped, set her bag down slowly. "Leaving. The business, the structure, all of it." He said it the way he said most things, evenly, without drama, as though he were reporting a fact rather than describing a seismic personal decision. But she had spent enough Thursday evenings in this room learning the geography of this man to hear what lived underneath the evenness. It will take time. These things don't end cleanly or quickly. But I have begun. She looked at him across the room. "What made you decide?" He was quiet for a moment. The city moved behind him through the floor-to-ceiling glass, indifferent and constant. "I slept 7 hours last Wednesday," he said. "And when I woke up, I lay there for a while, which I have not done in 10 years, because lying still without sleeping felt like losing, like the insomnia was winning. But last Wednesday I lay there and I thought about what I wanted the next Wednesday to look like. And the Wednesday after that." He paused. "I have not thought about what I wanted in a very long time. I have only thought about what needed to be managed." "And what do you want?" she asked. He looked at her directly, in the way that was his habit and his nature, the way that had unnerved people in rooms for 20 years. But what was in his eyes now was not what had unnerved those rooms. What was in his eyes now was the specific vulnerability of a man who is about to say something true and knows he cannot unsay it. "I want to know what this is," he said. "Between us. I want to know if it is only what it appears to be on the surface, or if it is what it feels like from where I am standing." The room was very quiet. Aaliyah Cross stood beside the massage table in her sage green uniform, with her black bag on the low table, and the amber light of the suite catching the dark warmth of her skin. And she looked at this man, this complicated, exhausted, slowly opening man with the dragon on his neck and the scars on his hands, and the laugh that had lasted 3 seconds on the phone and contained more honesty than most people managed in years. And she made the decision that she had been quietly making for several Thursdays without admitting it to herself. "You know what it is," she said. "You're just not used to saying things you can't control the outcome of." Something moved through his face. "No," he admitted.
I'm not.
"Neither am I," she said. "For different reasons." He crossed the room then, not quickly, not with the sudden decisive movement of a man accustomed to action, but slowly and deliberately. The walk of a man who is being careful with something he does not want to damage. He stopped in front of her with the particular nearness of a person who has decided that distance is no longer the right strategy. Close enough that she could see the fine detail of the dragon tattoo above the robe's collar, the exact darkness of his exhausted eyes, the way his jaw held the last of the tension that the rest of him had begun to release. He lifted one scarred hand, and with a carefulness that was entirely at odds with everything the world knew about him, tucked a single curl of her afro back from her face. His hand stayed at her jaw for a moment, barely touching. "I don't know how to do this," he said quietly. "Any of this. The ordinary version of things." "I know," she said. "I'll show you. Same way you showed me that the door was always there." "I didn't show you anything," he said. "That was you." "Then we're even," she said. He looked at her for one more long moment, and then he did something that the dragon on his neck and the scars on his hands and 10 years of sleepless nights and everything that had made him Kwon Jae-sung had not managed to do. He let go. Completely and without strategy and without knowing the outcome. And it was, in all the ways that mattered, the most powerful thing he had ever done. Months passed in the way that good months pass. Not quickly, not slowly, but with the satisfying density of time that is being used rather than survived. The clinic on Vermont Avenue opened on a Wednesday morning with green paint on the walls and 2 new therapists and a waiting list that Aaliyah had not allowed herself to fully believe in until she was standing inside it with the key in her hand and the smell of sandalwood in the air. Kwon did not attend the opening. They had agreed, without discussing it at length, that the architecture of what they were building required patience and discretion, and the understanding that some walls come down faster than others. But that Wednesday evening, after the last client had left and Petra had locked the front desk and the new therapists had gone home, a car stopped outside the clinic on Vermont Avenue and a man in a dark coat. No suit jacket, no armor, just a coat and dark trousers and a dragon visible above the collar, came in through the back door and sat in the small room with the green walls and the smell of sandalwood. Aaliyah made tea. She brought 2 cups and sat across from him, and they talked for 2 hours about nothing consequential. About his son June, who had video called him for the first time last week, and who had his father's jaw and his mother's eyes, and had apparently developed an interest in astronomy that Kwon found genuinely baffling and secretly wonderful. About the property 3 doors down from the clinic that she had her eye on for a second location. Someday, when someday felt less theoretical. About the specific sound that her car made on cold mornings, which he had heard about enough times to feel he had a personal relationship with the vehicle. He slept that night for 8 hours. And the night after that. And the night after that. The dragon on his neck did not change. The scars on his hands did not disappear. The past was the past, permanent and factual, and he had made his accounting with it in the slow and imperfect way that people make accounting with things that cannot be undone. Not by erasing it, but by deciding, with full knowledge of everything it contained, that the next chapter would be written differently. Aaliyah Cross had not set out to save anyone. She had set out to pay her rent, to build her clinic, to do the work she had always known she was meant to do. The quiet, precise, unglamorous work of helping people find the door back to themselves. She had not expected the door to swing both ways, but that was the thing about doors, she thought. Locking up the clinic on a Thursday night with the key that was hers and the walls that were green and the future that was, for the first time in a long time, something she could look at directly. They never only open one way. He hadn't slept in 10 years, and one ordinary woman, with no title, no power, no expensive suit, gave him back something no amount of money could buy. Aaliyah wasn't trying to save anyone. She was just doing what she always knew how to do, taking care. That's what we do, isn't it? We take care of everyone. But what about us? The same wisdom she carried in her hands, Korean women have passed down for generations, not as luxury, as ritual, as self-respect. If you're 45 or older and you're finally ready to understand what your skin actually needs, Korean Glass Skin Secrets was made for you. Complete morning and night routines, 15 Korean ingredients that truly work for mature black skin, tea recipes, a spa ritual you can do at home. All of it adapted for your skin type, your stage of life. Point your camera at the QR code on screen right now, or find the link in the description. If this story moved you, stop for a moment and reflect. Have you ever been the person in the room that everyone underestimated? The one without the title, without the power, without the expensive suit, who turned out to be exactly what someone needed most? Or perhaps you have been on the other side, so armored by what life demanded of you that you forgot what it felt like to simply rest, to be seen, to let someone close enough to matter. And if someone unexpected ever reached the part of you that you had given up on, the part you stopped believing anyone could find, did you let them in? Or did you push them away because vulnerability felt too much like losing? Tell us your experiences and feelings in the comments. We read them all. And if you believe in stories about redemption, love, and the quiet courage it takes to choose peace over power, leave a like, be sure to subscribe to the channel, and click join to become a part of our community and help the channel.